Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce Keston Sutherland on behalf of the Committee on Poetics, which sets standards for poetic production and production targets and so on. Keston Sutherland is a Marxist poetic critic. That's a description I choose carefully and distinguish from a Marxist poetry critic. Sutherland is a poetic critic of Marx and a Marxist critic of poetry, hence his practice is Marxist poetic. It is based on a claim that Marx was a romantic poet, a claim Sutherland is developing in a series of important essays, and which will in turn support claims about the work done by radical contemporary poetry. The description is based also in Sutherland's claim that the poetry of William Wordsworth and J.H. Prynne can be read for a dialectical, poetic, critical practice he brings to bear on Marx. So Keston Sutherland is a Marxist poetic critic. How does this work when he's about his work? Let's look briefly at two of Sutherland's most justly celebrated essays, Marx in Jargon, the opening essay in his book Stupefaction, A Radical Anatomy of Phantoms, and Wrong Poetry, published in Textual Practice in 2010 and also included in Stupefaction. In the first of these, he takes issue with Marx's English translators for using the abstract word congelation for the German Galater in Marx's discussion in Das Kapital of the way human labour is expressed in commodities. Sutherland protests that Capital in English is, quote, a text boiled down from its original state of internal generic disintegration, stripped of its difficult collage of the poetic, the scientific, and the jargonistic within individual sentences and ideas, his emphasis, its constitutive ambiguity, and most important of all, its satire, and transformed into an array of undifferentiated concepts for theoretical consumption. That is to say, from the point of view of the philologically based poetic Sutherland derives from Prynne, the translation disregards genre, the text voice effect, and the dialectical force of language from the level of the individual, historically saturated syllable through to its highest level, rhetorical forms, pressing against the conceptual analytical work. And the pressure of conceptual analytical work upon a word like Galater, whose origins in the knacker's yard now give rise, in 2015, to my thought of MSM, to the patty of mechanically separated meat served in breakfast muffins in the cafe in this building. Whenever my hungry stomach contemplates its availability proximate to my office, it churns. Think of stinking curdled milk while we're about it. The product is served indeed, served by its eaters, such as the commodity. Now let's turn to Wrong Poetry, first read incidentally at the Poetry and Poetics workshop at the University of Chicago. The thinking of this essay centres on Wordsworth's poem The Thorn, and in particular the notorious lines describing a pond. I've measured it from side to side, 'tis 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. Long a thorn in the side of Wordsworth's readers. Sutherland's essay opens out from these intractable or all too tractable lines, from the proposition that the lines are wrong and that they put their reader in the wrong, however he or she might determine to account for them. Accountancy fails. These wrong lines were lines by which Wordsworth stood stubbornly in the face of ridicule and acknowledging the poem as tedious. The essay makes of wrong poetry a category that is not a category, for a recognisable category would merely open a new column in the accounts. Rather, Sutherland writes, wrong poetry means just that, a trail of doubt that confounds identification, the perdition of confidence in being right, passionate unease about what will qualify or matter, a compulsion to sublate first reactions under the pressure of sheer insistence on whatever most emphatically escapes them, and irreversible resistance of whatever thought seems most nearly conclusively acceptable or is in any measure already familiar and satisfying. It is impossible for me to imagine a critical programme more demanding than this. Think how far it takes us from the banal application of Marxist concepts, how very far. Dwell on the adjective passionate in passionate unease, not just indulging a little doubt, but pressing hard against the columns of what will qualify or matter. And that is critical. It is Marxist poetic criticism as Sutherland practices it. As a poet and critic, Keston has long set an example for me of a passionate practice, one I cannot begin to measure up to. Just as his Marxist and his poetical criticism cannot be sundered, his fierce commitment to a philosophical poetry itself constitutes a political challenge. His poetry is not political by virtue of a stance, but it puts pressure on the categorical separation of poetry from the political world and insists that the political must be critiqued by the poetical as well as the poetical by the political. The present lecture, Blocks Formed Since the Crash, will, we are advised, hazard two strong claims. First, that despite decades of so-called Marxist literary criticism, we lack a properly Marxist critical vocabulary adequate to the work of interpreting the complexity of new poetic writing. And second, that the relation of contemporary anti-capitalist poetry to modernism has been misrepresented as principally a relation to modernist poetry, whereas the relation that may really matter for this new work in Blocks is the so far inadequately conceived relation of poetry to modernist prose and its progeny. I expect, therefore, that we shall be engaged in a further stage in the development of a Marxist poetic criticism, which is among the most compelling and urgent intellectual projects I know. The articulation of a poetics of politics and a politics of poetics has remained since Shelley as the horizon to which English language poetry has largely failed so much as to aspire, and which Keston Sutherland's work once again sets shiningly before both poets and critics. Keston.
Dumbfounded, really, with gratitude for that extraordinary introduction. Thank you so much, John. And thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you for this invitation to speak again at the University of Chicago, which is a place very dear to my heart. In fact, this talk has more than an incidental historical relation to this very institution, since some of the poetry that I'll be describing, some of it in passing, some of it by tarrying with it today, actually was written first after an invitation by the editors of the Chicago Review back in 2007, and so was, in a sense, directly precipitated by the generosity of an invitation from people based right here. So the tradition that I'll be attempting to describe in this talk today bears a significant relation to this institution, at least in my mind and in my heart. So I'm very pleased to be here. I just want to say before I start about this, what John says about the idea that Marx emerges or is represented in my work as a romantic poet. I think this is, first of all, I think this is indubitably the case. If you've read any of the poetry which Marx himself wrote prior to his very solemn repudiation of this practice when he was 19 years old, then it indubitably and very obviously is romantic poetry with a not just capital but sort of hyperbolically inflated R at the start. Marx gave this up when he was 19 in disgust, not exactly at his failure to write beautiful poetry simply, or poetry that he felt was compelling enough, but as he put it in the letter to his father in which he very solemnly announced this repudiation, it was poetry which, rather than being a condensation of energies, was instead a dissipation of energies. So there was, it occurred to him at this time that his practice was essentially barren of a certain form of pressure, or it had been evacuated, or pre-evacuated of a certain kind of pressure, which thereafter he tried to produce in all of his dialectical thinking in particular. So he was a romantic poet. My contestation, since thinking about that early poetry by Marx, was that he gave up and abandoned poetry in such a way that he had more or less determined that poetry could not finally actually be abandoned from his mature critique of political economy, so that poetry was abandoned in such a way that it was designed thereafter, I wouldn't use the verb to haunt, but rather to kind of track and to reappear in, and in some more substantial sense actually to underline and underwrite all of his mature thinking too. So I do think that there is a direct relation between Marxist mature thinking and poetry itself, and in particular romantic poetry. But as John says, I also think that there is a poetics at stake in Marx's own writing, and it's this which I'll be attempting to begin to elaborate a little today, together with a description of some very recent poetry, in fact, barely published, barely even existent poetry. The text which will be my focus today came out, I think, a month ago, from the UK. So I've taken what I hope will not seem like the disrespectful or unduly rash decision to lay aside the written script which I had prepared for this talk today, and instead to extemporize a talk. And I did this for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because when I looked at the script which I had written, it seemed to me to be dissatisfyingly, prematurely over-formulated. So the thinking which I'm still now trying to begin to do about this poetry seemed already a little bit too dead in the script which I wrote. And I wondered whether that might simply be a consequence of trying to write too soon about texts which have only just now erupted into the world. And secondly, these texts are simply so contemporary that it felt to me like it might do better justice to them to try to think on the spot and to do a kind of more livingly subjective kind of presentation about them. That expression, the living subject, might make more sense, I hope, after this talk. So forgive me if there are moments, or forgive me if there are in fact long durations during this talk which are inchoate, and I'll of course be more than happy to try to make them coate during the Q&A if I can. So what I'm going to try to do today then in this talk is to think about what might have been the consequences for a new kind of poetry, what I at least will propose we could think as a new kind of poetry that has emerged particularly in the writing of younger UK poets since around 2007-2008, since the financial crash. What might have been the consequences of that financial crash for the question of form as it's practiced in this poetry, as it's latently or implicitly conceived in this poetry? What might be the consequences both for how poets have actually set about trying to write, presumably in a state very often of a kind of blindness with respect to their own intentions, and what might be the consequences for how we now, as critics, might begin constructively to try to build for ourselves a category of form which might bear some substantial historical relation to what's happened since 2008 in the financial crash. I'm going to do that by showing you a few slides which are examples from poems written during this period, which, according to the criteria which I shall experimentally set up today, would qualify as blocks. This is the name which I'll propose for this form. And I'm also going to try to make this argument by pursuing further some of the analysis of Marx's writing, which John very generously referenced in his wonderful introduction. And I've been constructing over the past 6 months or so in particular, but for a couple of years, a kind of experimental glossary of concepts in Das Kapital in particular, but also in Marx's letters, notebooks, and in the Grundrisse, which, in my view, have remained in a state of latency or immobility within these texts by Marx. And just briefly to say what I mean by that before I start the talk proper, what I mean is that I took my inspiration for this practice from the French edition of the complete works of Sigmund Freud, which was overseen by Jean Laplanche and others. Laplanche wrote a theoretical treatise explaining his experience of translating Freud into French. And this was presented in a text called Traduire Freud, Translating Freud. And Laplanche there claimed that one of the extraordinary revelations for him and for his co-translators when they were embarked on this work was that besides the concepts in Freud which everybody already was equipped through familiarity with Freud's oeuvre to recognize on sight, such as, for example, repression, sublimation, these familiar concepts, there were in Freud's oeuvre, according to Laplanche, also concepts which he theoretically described as latent concepts. By this he means concepts, words, which appear with a notable frequency across the whole extension of the oeuvre, but which weren't necessarily identified by Freud himself as having a definitely or determinately conceptual status. His chief example of this is the concept which he describes as the après coup, which in English he proposed this should be translated as afterwardsness, though I'm not sure about that translation personally. In any case, he discovered a number of these, he said, and he said it was only through the work of translation that Freud could be reconstructively reread in this way, so that concepts which might have eluded the author himself could at last be identified and then mobilized for a new kind of theoretical reinterpretation of the work of Freud. In addition then to this concept of latent concepts, which I take from Laplanche, I want to propose a second order of concept, which I think is present also in Marx's work, which I've called the immobile concept. And by that I mean a kind of concept which already does seem to have a certain kind of determinantly conceptual aspect, a word which reappears with sufficient frequency that it seems to represent a category and seems to be doing a certain kind of conceptual work, but which has not actually been so far in the reception of Marx, and in particularly in Anglophone reception, has not yet been mobilized by critics or by theoreticians, and has not therefore been able to circulate in Marxist criticism and to do the kinds of work which I think it was set up to do in Marx's criticism. So briefly to anticipate that part, here are some of the concepts which belong to this experimental glossary, which I've begun to compile since I've been studying again in detail the German text of Das Kapital, and I'm going to refer to all of these concepts during this talk today, if I get time, though I'm already probably using up too much of my time in this introduction. But in any case, I'll have a go at introducing some of these concepts. There are a great deal more of them, but let me go back to the start. So around about the time of 2008, there began to appear in the UK poems which, described as simply as possible, looked like blocks of justified prose on the page. Here is an example from Sean Bonney's Letters, another example from a poem called Our Vilest Lives by Verity Spot. It goes on, continues as a block for a number of pages beyond this page. Here's a page from the extraordinary and virtuosic text by Danny Hayward, which is the text I mentioned, which was just published a month ago. This goes on for about 28 pages in a continuous, uniform motion like this. Here's the frontispiece from Stuart Calton's All Over Body Ghosts, which I think is a kind of graphic pun, actually, about the kind of enclosure which these poems have produced. And I began to wonder what exactly this form might represent, and how it might be, in fact, possible to think this graphic disposition of text on the page as a kind of form. What might be at stake for the question of form itself was a kind of contestation of the category of form being made in this new type of disposition of text on the page, which began to appear with surprising frequency and eventually actually to proliferate to the point where poets began to ask who actually was writing with line breaks any longer. And it seemed implicitly to be a kind of comment on the status of the line break, in fact, that perhaps poetry in the minds of certain poets had temporarily and for the time being exhausted the power of the line break to produce contradiction or to produce certain intensities of irony, and perhaps the line break had indeed been over-depended on to do that kind of work in the poetry of the preceding 10 or so years. Now I need to start my little historical preamble before we get to this moment of 2008 by retreating back to the period of 2003 in order to offer a few speculations about what this poetry might have been responding to in the previous period of production. So around about 2003, as everyone will remember, this country that we're in now, and the UK too, were busy preparing to fabricate the means through the United Nations and by other political channels to invade Iraq. At the time, this was a cultural and political cataclysm, certainly in the UK, and all of the poets that I knew at the time were more or less closely or distantly involved with the protests and social movements which then erupted in reaction against this attempt by our government to invade this country. And a very simple analysis, an obvious analysis, but also a passionate analysis, was, I think, very widely shared, or perhaps even universally shared amongst poets at this point in the UK. And it was essentially a kind of Marxist-Leninist analysis of what was about to be attempted on this country. So the Marxist-Leninist analysis, which I expect people will be familiar with, is that when markets get completely saturated, then national jurisdictions which regulate those markets are obliged by the intrinsic logic of the capital relation itself violently to extend their reach and to carve open new markets and impose the authority of their jurisdictions and to create room for new consumer bases and demand for their own corporations. So it seemed to everybody in the UK like very transparently this was what was about to happen to the people of Iraq, that the Americans and the English would carve open this country, create new markets there, and that this was straightforwardly, that it couldn't be more transparent, that this was a perfect example of what Lenin described in his account of imperialism as the inevitable last stage of capitalism. Poets were very passionately angry and distressed about this. And poets, everyone that I knew, I think at the time, participated in what was the largest and most just overwhelming march that had ever taken place on British soil up to that point. So you may remember that in 2003, a march estimated by its organisers and participants to be 2 million people progressed through the centre of London. And I was on that march, and incidentally, it kind of really did go to your head at the time, and it felt almost as if the passion represented collectively by that body of people could perhaps achieve just about anything. So there was this moment of a kind of exhilaration combined with kind of very aggressive despair at the seeming inevitability of this invasion. And it was kind of theoretically and intellectually girded by reference to this analysis from Lenin about imperialism. Now, the kind of poetry which appeared at this point and which seemed to be energized by this particular moment of social protest and by this history looming in front of everybody, was a poetry which I would describe as one in which what was put at stake was a kind of split or schizoid poetic subjectivity. Now, what I mean by that is that the poetic subject which emerged in the poetry in reaction to the invasion of Iraq and the lead up to the invasion was one in which concentrations both of passion and also of kind of theoretical or interrogative energy were widely polarized or split into, on the one hand, a kind of aggressively interiorized self-examination, and particularly a self-examination of trauma on the part of the poetic subject. So it's a poetry which was very privately inward and which examined personal and biographical histories of distress and failure, whilst in the same breath and at the same time and as part of the same complex act of inward and outward overreaching, also tried to describe this impossibly distant scene of carnage, which everybody recognized, of course, was gruesomely over-mediated to the point where our relation to it, though I don't think anybody really shared or accepted the kind of Baudrillard analysis of mediation, nonetheless, there was a kind of horrifying and painful realism about the obscenely over-mediated state in which this distant pain arrived. So the poetic subject put at stake in this poetry, then, was one in which concentrations of energy were split between these two poles. They were very defiantly sort of separated and distant poles between, on the one hand, the unbearably immediate, and on the other hand, the obscenely over-mediated. And I could mention lots of examples of this. I mean, there's wonderful examples of poems which could more or less fit this category, though of course no poem will perfectly fit it, but examples by Andrea Brady, by J.H. Prynne indeed. So if you've read J.H. Prynne's To Pollen, you'll find there a poem in which, you know, a kind of distant kind of superorbital purview of the carnage in Iraq suddenly collapses and folds into the scene of a single child being held in the arms of his father, crushed to bits by a mortar explosion. So that's the kind of telescopic overreaching which felt at the time to be a kind of compulsory condition of the forms of passion and agitation which then existed, and to which the poetic intelligence was made subject in the poems of this period. The unbearably immediate, the obscenely over-mediated. Now, as time passed, and the 2 million people on this march unfortunately rapidly dwindled first to, I think, around 30,000 the next march, then to about 5,000, and then in these various groupuscules which grew up around the country under the banner of the Stop the War group, groups of about 8, which I would attend a couple of years afterwards. There was inevitably a kind of sobering and reckoning with the apparent failure of this enormous and unprecedented social movement. And poets reacted to this failure too. I think there was a kind of semi-conscious and sobering recognition among poets in the UK that the poetry in which agitation and passion had been put at stake in this way, in the shape of a kind of unbearably split or schizoid subject, might somehow have missed something, that there might be some costs of that poetry which might now need to be counted. And it seemed to me, as history progressed and time passed and this moment became more distant, as though what emerged in the wake of this defeat as a new kind of formal priority for poetry was that poetry should somehow find a new way of being able to deal with a kind of hitherto overlooked or neglected middle ground of proximate mediations. In other words, that poetry, rather than staring into the heart and at the distant, over-mediated, obscene horizon of carnage elsewhere, should instead somehow try to retool, recalibrate, and learn instead to be able to identify more proximate, perhaps less dramatic, perhaps less spectacular forms of damage that surround it all of the time. Now, I think one of the consequences of this at first entirely instinctive kind of change of or shift in perspective was that it felt as though a different kind of Marxism might be required in this poetry, and in order also to make sense of this poetry. So both a different kind of Marxist poetry and a different kind of Marxist poetics. And I think that what gradually changed was that this Marxism, whose priority had previously been essentially the Leninist one of the critique of imperialism, gradually shifted toward a much more detailed and patient engagement with the very text of Capital itself, and a kind of a re-encounter with the categories in Capital of labour, of value, all of the various accounts of relation, of mediation, the accounts of the various value forms, systems of production, surplus value, all of these things which at the time of the previous social cataclysm in the lead up to Iraq might have seemed as though they could for the time being kind of be suspended, since they weren't so immediately explosive as the problem of imperialism. But as that problem receded, and particularly then after the financial crash of 2007-2008, whose consequences everybody instantly recognised would be catastrophic for the lives of millions of people, at this moment, suddenly these other categories, which might help us critically to understand more proximate forms of contradiction and suffering in life, acquired a new kind of presence and urgency in the thinking of poets. Now, I think that this new kind of Marxism, as I've tried to describe it, of course it's not a new kind, it's the original kind, it's what the text already was to begin with, but it's part of the work of that text which had not been prioritised, it had been deprioritised as poets instead focused on the problem of imperialism. As poets began instead to go back and to think through these classical Marxist categories, so at the same time, to put it as weakly as possible, by a kind of coincidence, poetry began to appear like this in blocks. And my question today is there a more substantial historical congruity between these two things, the return to a different kind of detailed Marx, and the prioritisation of proximate mediations, and the shape of this text on the page, the form in which poetry began to be presented around this period. Now, I need to now progress to this moment, which has become iconic and perhaps will be familiar to you all too. Around 2010, when the new English government, the coalition of Tories and Liberals, was elected, a new sequence of social movements suddenly erupted, particularly on the streets of London, the capital of the UK, and this is one of the most iconic of these kind of cataclysms. This was the culmination of a march of students, both high school students and university students, and also of kind of university sector union representatives and members through the streets of London in protest against the British coalition government's bill, which proposed that the kind of last remnant of a free state-sponsored university education should be tossed on the scrap heap, and that we should move to a fully marketised system of education, and that fees would rise from £0 or from £3,000 for some students up to £9,000. So there was this great eruption of very passionate anger, particularly by young people against the government of the day in 2010. This is the 10th of November 2010. This march progressed through the streets, and finally there erupted this great cataclysm, this paroxysm of anger, here at the scene of Millbank, which was the headquarters of the Tory party in the government at this point, and thousands, I think about 30,000 students packed into this central area of Millbank, laid siege to the government headquarters, smashed down the glass front of this building, ran in, tore out the furniture, built a bonfire in the courtyard here, and then many of them ascended up to the roof and essentially raised the flag of the student movement. So it was an extremely kind of paroxysmic moment for this protest movement. Here's an aerial view of all those students crammed into this courtyard space outside Millbank, and this is the government headquarters. It was a thrilling moment. It was genuinely a moment where it seemed as though passion had boiled up to the point where, again, perhaps anything might be possible. But the feeling of being a participant in this was that it required a thorough kind of new reckoning with all sorts of complex mediations to do with questions of value, which were newly at stake in not only in the real logic of what was happening under the so-called austerity regime at this point, but also they were awash in the media at this point. So to make a very quick comparison, it seemed to everybody during the Iraq War stupefyingly clear what was happening. And this sense that everybody was being stupefied by how transparent the logic of this event was even personally embodied then in the figure of George W. Bush. It seemed that a stupid representative of a transparently stupefying historical logic. And so the poetry could only respond aghast at the stupidity and transparency of this logic. Here it seemed to actually intimidatingly complicated what was happening suddenly, and the media too even reflected this and seemed suddenly to sober up and to acquire a kind of conscience about the actual intelligence of its audience. And then daily you have Nobel Prize winning economists on the BBC News explaining the ins and outs of, collateralized debt obligations and credit default swaps and subprime mortgages, etc. So suddenly you have circulating in the public sphere all of this very exotic jargon from the discipline of economics. People were thinking in these terms suddenly, trying to think through these terms. One of the iconic shapes that began to emerge during this period, again we have some aerial photos here, were the shapes produced on the streets by what I think is also here in the United States called kettling, police kettles, which is this fairly historically recent tactic, at least in the UK, of containment, so-called, pressing bodies into these spaces and then keeping them trapped there for deliberately, extremely frustratingly overextended periods of time. And so people will not be allowed to leave the kettles when they need to, urinate, or people will be trapped there with their babies. They can't get home from work. If you happen to have strayed in, that's your fault, etc. There were many of these, and they typically produced these compressions of flesh, these compressions of bodies in these kinds of forms. When you see them from above like this, they're very striking. This one I thought was particularly piquant because here you have on the one side the representative of state violence, on the other side capital itself. And it did feel a little as though these were the firm, justified, the limits of justification or justice on either side, which were pressing or compressing together these lives, these individualities into these shapes which not only pushed people closer to each other, but in pushing them closer to each other also caused to erupt these sensations of being trapped, this terrible frustration, this sense of the kind of livid physical injustice of being contained in these shapes. And I thought this was quite fascinating also as an example of the kinds of linguistic discharge phenomena, we might call them, which erupt at the edges of these limits. So obviously the police vans are parked up against and comprise parts of these kettles too, and people react linguistically in the only way that's rational, really, by doing that kind of thing. Anyhow, there is obviously a kind of superficial visual resemblance then between the shapes produced on the street by police tactics and kettling at this point and these blocks which are here. But I've suggested that we might also require a new kind of newly subtilized and perhaps more detailed type of Marxist critical poetics in order to give a more substantial account of how this might be not just a kind of superficial graphic resemblance, but also a new assignment in the history of poetic form itself. So I've produced for you this handout, which has turned out to be, unfortunately, far too copious for the 15 minutes or so that I have left. But I just want to introduce to you, through the use of this handout and through also this glossary, which I've given here, some of the concepts which I think might help us to establish the actual formal originality of this poetry and to be able to think through the category of the poetic form, the block, which I'm proposing we use to describe these poems. So the first one is the übergreifende Subjekt. this is one of these concepts which I think has not been properly mobilized from the work of Marx. What it refers to then is a form of collective subject, but more than simply a collective subject, more than a collectivity of individual subjectivities. The übergreifende Subjekt is the comprehensive, dominant, all-grasping or all-overreaching subject. It bears an etymological relation to Begriff in German, the concept, and it's clear, I think, that Marx had the Hegelian account of the concept somewhere in mind, and indeed the Hegelian account of comprehensive knowledge from the last chapter of Phenomenology somewhere in mind when he proposed this concept of the übergreifende Subjekt. There are two forms of übergreifende Subjekt, or to switch to English, the dominant or all-grasping subject, Marx says, and each of them represents a different stage of technological developments. They are historically distinguished, as well also as being logically distinguished by Marx. The first is the human collective, which works all together. When we all produce between ourselves a kind of harmony of activity, or a concert or solidarity, in which all of us act in ways which cooperatively produces a greater product than we could any of us individually, or if we were fully atomized, then this is one form of the comprehensive subject for Marx. But he says also there is a second kind, which is the fully automated or mechanized form of the comprehensive subject. At this point, individual lives become mere organs of a fully mechanized or automated comprehensive subject. So from being ourselves, or having at least ourselves the potential to comprise this comprehensive subject, Marx says what has happened under the inescapable and intrinsic pressure of the logic of the capital relation itself is that we have been excluded from the potential of being ourselves or constituting ourselves this all-grasping subject, and we have ceded it instead to mechanization. It's, for me, a very interesting point, this in Capital, which provokes me to think about a number of potential questions for how we might conceive art too. At the bottom of the first page of your handout here, I've sort of offered a couple of rough thoughts about, to begin simply from the point of view of analogy, is it possible to conceive of a kind of authorship or a kind of poetic subjectivity, a poetic subject, a kind of poetic writing, which might be capable in something like this way, something analogous to this sense that Marx describes here, of binding, of comprehending, of grasping together into one sealed unit all of the thoughts which it might contain. And I began to think about these tube-like poems, and it seemed to me that these poems seem to meet this one criterion, potentially, in that in their extremely compressed and squashed interiors, there is what feels like a potentially kind of dizzying potential infinity of mediations, particularly approximate mediations, as I said earlier. So life is explored and exploited in these poems in every single direction that you can imagine at once. There is no kind of consistency of voice. There is no stylistic consistency. What instead these poems try to do is to grasp together, to contain, to bind together every possible form of generic switch, every possible type of language object that could be sort of bagged and bound into one shape. So there's everything from discharge phenomena, the gnashing of teeth, and pre-verbal sonic detritus of unrepresentable mental states, through to the most unrestrained exhibitions of grammatical mastery in the shape of sentences, whose reaching in and out of subjectivity intimates a potentially infinite expressive elasticity. Evidently, I wrote that one sentence down. Danny Hayward's text, I think, is a very good example of this. And just so that you hear a bit of what it sounds like, this kind of grammatical mastery, one sentence from this. So he says, "We felt of this experience of having a reason that it would somehow be absolutely stubborn and unchangeable, an inflammable centre of our life against which all further envelopes and requests for reasons or demands for participation would shatter into millions of shards of porous bone that would then dissolve into liquid and run in thousands of refreshing rivulets into the heart of everyone whose reason has been maligned or scorned or cut up into a million pieces and scattered into a million secret hiding places across their lives, so that they were faced to be chased through it forever, having only the faintest and most agonizingly uncontrollable sense that it is there in spite of what they say, speaking through their envelopes, and that, if only it were possible to stop, that it could be retrieved and held and gazed upon and known for what it is, that it is the deep unmoving centre of the silence of those who speak." So that's one sentence. It's packed full of sentences like that. Okay, so there is an attempt then to produce a certain kind of at least mimesis or virtual equivalent of a certain kind of übergreifendes or all-grasping subject. There's much more to say about that, but I'm going to have to move on. There is also in Marx an account, and we need this second type of subjectivity too in order to piece together a more comprehensive account of this poetry. There's an account in Marx of partial and incomplete states of the subject, as I've called it on page 2 of your handout here. Now, it's important that for Marx, subjectivity is not a priori. What I mean by that is that human living individuals are not a priori the subjects of their own lives. Rather, like other forms of inanimate or material entities, or even like abstract entities such as logical relations, which also can become subjects in Marx, human individuals must become subject, wird Subjekt, as he says, through entering into a specific relation with the dominant regime of objectivity under the capital relation. Now, this dominant regime of objectivity, which we have no choice but to enter into relation with, is what Marx called Wertgegenständigkeit. This is a word which has been lost in the English translation of Marx, but it's a very important word for Marx. It means value objectivity, and it's the dominant regime of objectivity. There is not for Marx objectivity as such. There is Wertgegenständigkeit, and then there are various complex forms of obviously corrupt class objectivity, which are what you will think is objective depending upon what your interests are. But above and beyond all of these, because of the abstract system of domination, there is Wertgegenständigkeit. And only in relation to this value objectivity can an entity, a relation, an individual become subject, Marx thinks. So, in order for the living subject, who we are, or could in potential yet become, in order for us to become ourselves, we have to enter into relation with value. We, in order to enter into relation to value, must ourselves become value forms. We are only able to enter into this relation under the regime of Wertgegenständigkeit by ourselves assuming the forms of value. It's at this point which the subject enters into the regime of form as such. Prior to this entrance into this regime, the subject is essentially immaterial from the perspective, from the standpoint of Wertgegenständigkeit. In other words, whatever anyone in this room might think, feel, dream, or desire is, strictly speaking, entirely irrelevant, except insofar as it can be represented in one of the value forms, exchange value, use value, or confusingly, value, these three forms in Marx. Besides, if you're not that, if you're not form, then you're just a bundle of nerve endings, completely dispensable and invisible from the point of view of Wertgegenständigkeit. Now, when, however, you do achieve subjectivity in relation to Wertgegenständigkeit, it comes at the cost of two specific orders of impoverishment, says Marx. Here is another concept which is latent in capital, has not yet been mobilized. The Wertspiegel, this is the mirror of value, and we don't appear as ourselves when we enter into relation with value objectivity and finally at last are able to become subject. What we appear is this form of objectively disfigured and extended or stretched version of our natural potential selves, in which appears as a reflection in the surface of the mirror of value itself. So if you think of a kind of fairground mirror, which when you stand before it sort of extends your limbs and shrinks your stomach and bends your head into a U or whatever it might be, this form of objective perceptual disfiguration of the human body is what appears in the Wertspiegel. For Marx, this is not figurative, it's a real material and substantial actual disfiguration of the life of the individual, which appears in the Wertspiegel, in the mirror of value. So that's the cost of becoming subject and appearing there. Another cost is that we have to become also a logical category. We become what Marx calls, this next concept, das wirkliche Nichtkapital. In other words, we become a negation of a logical entity by becoming subject under capital. We become the real not capital. Marx says capital cannot function without the not capital, which is the living human individual body, present in time and alive, he specifies, as these predicates are in fact quite exotic, and for Marx they kind of are. Typically we are not present in time and alive because we exist typically as value forms for Marx. However, the real subject, present in time and alive, even that part of our existences, in other words, which is not wholly absorbed into the uniform and continuous motion of capitalist productivity, exists as a form of logical negation of a logical entity. It exists as the Nichtkapital. Now, most important for today, and I'm mindful of the time, but Marx says that through a certain kind of pressure And Marx, in Das Kapital, is absolutely preoccupied with what I would call the physics of labour, the kinetics of labour, the kinds of distortions produced physically in bodies by the labour process. He describes this concept of the elastische menschliche Naturschranke, the elastic human natural limit. Now, the elastic human natural limit is an essential part of his analysis of capital. The elastic human natural limit is what is stubbornly left of us when we are pressed so hard by the demands of capital up against the wall that all we end up being is what Marx calls minimal Widerstand, the minimum possible resistance that a body can push back. Existence then is shrunk or reduced to sheer pushback. That's what it is. This dynamic grows up, a kind of dialectic, Marx says, between Druck and Widerstand. Capital is pressure, squeezing, and human existence, on the other hand, is trying to stand up to, trying to resist, but all the time being crushed against the wall. The verbs and the nouns which he uses here to describe this consistently, and again, most of these have been wiped out of the English translations, Aussaugung, Auspumpen, Entleerung. Marx always says the body is sucked out, pumped out, and emptied over and over again. It's at points a conspicuously semi-sexualized description of what happens to the body. At other points, it sounds gruesomely like the body has been turned into a kind of icing gun that capital just steps on, and you fly out like a popped pimple or something. But that's human existence. We're pressed up against this wall. Capital essentially is pressure. Just to be conceptually specific about this for a moment, it's not capital simply as a generality, which is this pressure. It specifically is the constant tendency, as Marx calls it, within the logic of the capital relation, to increase the magnitude of relative surplus value. And what that means is not just to extend the periods for which we work, not just to move from 8 hours working day to 10 hours working day, but instead, and here again, this I think resembles the logic of the poems which I've produced on the screen today, instead constantly to intensify the forms of activity which bodies are forced to do within fixed time limits. So if you're stuck between these two limits, start work, end work, then capital can increase its relative surplus value by pressing down so-called necessary labour, the thing that you have to do to survive, and increasing its so-called surplus value, its relative surplus value, by making sure that you do everything 10 times as fast. This poetry, too, is compressed within these limits, and within those limits tries to do everything that it possibly can, every kind of activity, in a kind of frenzy of like conscious and semi-unconscious variety, every kind of language work that you can do, every kind of poetical subjectivity, every kind of poetical expression. Another specific impoverishment of the origin of value, and which is our lives, Marx describes in Das Kapital, is the reduction of human life from Arbeitskraft, which is well known as a Marxist concept, which is simply labour power. So everyone who's read Capital knows that labour power appears on virtually every page. This is the form of the commodity in which we sell our lives, labour power. But Marx says that labour power progressively, in fact, is distilled into or reduced to Triebkraft, and this has been wiped out of the English translation. So Fawkes gives a paraphrase, motive force, but evidently for Marx these are twinned concepts, Arbeitskraft, Triebkraft, they appear next to each other, and Triebkraft is literally just drive power, the sheer power of the drive. When humanity is pressed up against this wall, what progressively it kind of gets squashed into, the experience of actually being crushed, is the experience of becoming Triebkraft. You lose the multifariousness, even of Arbeitskraft or labour power, which requires the exercise perhaps of a variety of competencies and skills and initiatives, and instead become the sheer power of switching a switch, pressing a button, entering data, whatever it might be. So you're literally just an input. Now, that's what happens the closer we get to being this Naturschranke, the thing pressed up against the wall, which is human elasticity, the fact that we can be crushed, the closer we get to being converted entirely into Triebkraft, Marx says. Finally, the most abject condition of all for this worker who has been compressed and squashed in this way is what in the Grundrisse Marx calls Punktualität, which is point-likeness or dot-likeness, as it's translated there, speck-likeness, dot-likeness, being crushed to the point where you really are nothing left but a kind of pinprick. And where is there to go from there except to explode back into the fullest shape that you can possibly try to find? I think, to come to another part of the kind of very provisional work I'm still trying to do about this poetry right now, that if we're to look for literary precedents for this form of compression, poetry, which in its very disposition on the page, tries somehow to capture the brutality of this form of squeezing, this pumping out, this pressurizing into a contained space, then really the great literary ancestor for this is not any poet that I know, but is Samuel Beckett. Samuel Beckett was very much preoccupied with pressures exerted against isolated and atomized individual bodies, the ways that they're pressed into scenes. If you look at the very last page of your handout under Beckett here on the back, I thought a particularly useful remark by Beckett was this one at the top from Lawrence E. Harvey's Conversations with Beckett, recorded in Paris 1961-1962. So this is Harvey's report of what Beckett said to him at that point. And I've started with this picture from Happy Days because 1961-1962 was the period when Beckett was writing that play. So Harvey reports, Beckett thinks that being is constantly putting form into danger. He aspires, he said, to what he recognizes is the impossible task of eliminating form, not just breaking it down or working against it, but eliminating it. He said that an ejaculation would perhaps be the most perfect expression of being. In a sense, Beckett made clear that he is anti-form, if form is considered to be order. He spoke of having come to feel the need for a disordered form, a broken form. The great task of the artist is to express being, and he sees being as a collection of meaningless movements. Being is chaotic, the opposite of ordered form. He thinks in the antinomy being-form. He is aware of the paradox of trying to eliminate form when language itself is form, but this viewpoint lies behind his breaking down of the traditional forms of language. Form, then, for Beckett is at odds with content, to put it as clearly as possible, as simply as possible. This also is the case briefly for Marx, and I'm going to go straight back to Beckett. Marx describes in Das Kapital how the form of labour directly contradicts the content of labour, that these two are simply irreconcilable, that what we're actually doing when we're moving our bodies around and being productive workers in the form of labour power feels to us entirely dispiritingly like a complete emptying or squeezing or crushing out of our existence. It doesn't feel like productivity. There is then a substantial sort of failure or mistransmission between form and content in Marx. Form is a problem for Marx. Form essentially should not exist as it presently exists, because form is a power of distillation into the abstract. It's a power of levelling, of flattening, and of dehumanizing, essentially. Now, it seems that Beckett instinctively felt something that almost resembles this specific cast of theoretical antipathy toward the very concept of or possibility of form. And in Beckett, too, it seems to have been related to pressure exerted against a body. In this case, the whole body, and here we have Winnie's head from Happy Days, reduced literally to a state of dot-likeness. So your distance from the stage, she's obviously quite far away from you, not anywhere near so close as this. Here she is looking on fondly at the potential means of escape from this compression, which she can't now even put back into her handbag, you'll remember if you've seen this play. Still more strikingly, 10 years later, Beckett's play Not I, again representing graphically on stage a dot-like humanity, since all you can see is the spotlight on a mouth. Anyone who's seen this play will remember that the entire stage is pitch black, except for this one mouth, which is spotlit. The actress who performs the part of Mouth, as she is simply called in this play, in this case Lisa Douane, is compressed, stuck, tied up into this firm board of a limit here, with only her mouth poking out through it. She's blindfolded, and the report of Billy Whitelaw, who first played this part, was that it induces into the body a terrible and inescapable, sickening sense of vertigo, because also the board was very slightly tilted forward. It was literally a form of physical torture for the actress to perform this part. And what happens in the play, if you haven't seen it or read it, is that there's a kind of uniform and continuous motion of text which comes out as a form of gabble, a kind of broken, incoherent kind of semi-autobiography, desperately trying to represent itself as the fantasy of a different person's life, which then is twice punctuated suddenly by a verbal act or simply a sound from the throat, a scream, which is an attempt to try to pierce through and to break out of this confinement into which the subject, in this case, has been compressed and stuck. And this scream, of course, proves to be entirely impotent by mouth. So mouth just screams, listens to the scream becomes yet another object, and then she goes back to producing the uniform continuous motion, and the play ends with her still performing this uniform and continuous motion of an incomprehensibly fast monologue in darkness. This, to me, is the most exciting and nearest type of formal precedent for the type of work that I've been trying to briefly introduce today. But to come back to the Lawrence E. Harvey report about Beckett's comments about form, we need to make an important distinction. I think there are a number of distinctions that should be made, but for the sake of today, just one distinction perhaps will suffice. The poets that I've been describing do not think in the antinomy being form. For these poets, it's the pressure exerted on poetic subjectivity by the sequence of impoverishments and cataclysms since 2003 and then latterly since 2008 has made it absolutely the first poetic priority to try to think through the categories of a Marxist critique of labour and of social relations and social injustice. So I think there is not perhaps anything like so pronounced an antinomy in this work at all, but if there were a kind of something that distantly resembled a kind of antinomy in this work, it wouldn't be being form, but it would be something like life form or passion form or existence itself form, a more sort of socially material and invested form of existence rather than being as a kind of philosophically conceived substrate which underlies form and which cannot be accessed by it. So the form which these poets then would be attempting, first of all, to reproduce, to consummate, and then potentially to explode and to shatter, would not be the same type of form, which is put at stake in Beckett's plays exactly, though it does bear a very striking resemblance in that it's a horribly claustrophobic and inhibiting form of pressure against the individual body. But it's form as the all-dominating abstraction, form as the form of the übergreifende subject in which individual lives are now disastrously and apparently forever compressed. So that's what this poetry is trying to do, I think. But of course there are quite a number of poets who are doing this now, and I don't doubt that each of them would dispute this account which I've improvised in a number of different ways, and each of them would have his or her own account of it. But it seems to me like there is something like a tendency in this work, and it's something like what I've tried to describe today, and that's as far as I've got thinking about it. So thank you very much for listening.